So the book of Numbers has lots of numbers in it. There are two census taken of the children of Israel in the book. But in the original language, it actually means in the desert of or in the wilderness. And so you have this account of the children of Israel's journey through the wilderness, the chronology of all this listed here in this book. And so the first 10 chapters still take place at Sinai. You remember that started in Exodus 19, and Leviticus, and now the beginning of Numbers will all take place here. The first 2 chapters take place really mainly around a census and an organization structure of the camp as they're beginning to set out on this journey towards the Promised Land. There'll be an army that is having to be formed in the sense of being out away from Sinai, and eventually having to go enter into the Promised Land. So you have chapter 1 detailing the census that's being taken of all the adult males specifically, and then the organization of the camp itself in chapter 2. I found this to be probably the most helpful with the understanding of chapter 2 especially. This is a diagram that kind of outlines exactly what you're seeing here, and so you can pause it and kind of look at this in more detail. But one other thing that's interesting to kind of notice, the one lack I would say in this is the shape. If you notice the numbers of the total amounts of the different tribes, the north and south sides are pretty comparable in the sense of their number of people. And this would be how the camps would travel throughout as they were moving across the desert. The west, however, you have the 3 smallest tribes that are there on the west side. And then especially as an overall, the east side is by far the largest overall side. So if you imagine how this would have looked proportionally, the amazing thing is they would have been traveling in what we would consider the shape of a cross, at least the way that we consider that depiction today. So just kind of an interesting note. Nothing really special drawn out about that, but just an observation. And I've heard others mention this point as well. So as we go through Numbers, just kind of keep that in mind. There's a couple places where it's interesting to think about, and it definitely adds kind of an extra dimension to the reading as you consider that being the shape of it. So thank you for your pursuit of the Word, and pray that this blesses you through our journey through Numbers. Leviticus 3 and 4, you'll remember that the Levites were not counted in the census that just took place in chapter 2. Chapter 3 you have is set apart just for the Levites. It goes to detail of the 3 different kind of subsections of Levites based on Levi's 3 sons. And each section of family will have their own specific role. Chapter 4 goes into great detail regarding the task at hand. All the Levites are to take care of the holy place, the tabernacle system, and transporting it, and all the different aspects that go into that special thing that was reserved for them, and they all had a specific role that had to be done carefully, so to protect themselves and to protect all that was surrounding God's holy place. So bless y'all today, and hope y'all have a fantastic Monday evening. Numbers chapter 5 and 6 today. You have a lot of things in these chapters regarding commitment, holiness, purity. You have much organization that happens in the first 4 chapters of Numbers, and now that things are organized, camps are set up, Levites and different ones are set apart. There's this, back to this understanding of conduct. We saw a lot of this in Leviticus, but now, again, there's this last kind of look at purity and holiness. There's a test in chapter 5 that the priests are able to do to determine holiness in specific personal situations. And then beyond that, in chapter 6, the Nazirite vow is a temporary vow that one can take. There would be lifelong Nazirites. You see that the most famous one is Samson, which will come up much later between Moses and David. So many things in this chapter to kind of chew on. Pray that your reading is blessed on this Tuesday. Just one chapter today, Numbers 7, is an important chapter in the tabernacle system. And you have the tabernacle being built in Exodus 40, and then open in a new way in Leviticus, kind of the 8th through 10th chapters. And then now, number 7, you have offerings being brought. All the leaders, the 12 different leaders over 12 days of the tribes, the heads of the tribes that were mentioned in the first couple chapters of Numbers, they bring offerings, very generous offerings, which is a great example for all of us today of that level of generosity. But you see the official establishment of the way the tabernacle is meant to work. In the final verse of chapter 7, you see that God speaks to Moses from in between the cherubim above the mercy seat, right there at the Ark of the Covenant. So important chapter, very detailed, but all for good purpose. So bless y'all today. Numbers 8 through 10, you have a lot of transitional pieces going on here. Several different details. In chapter 8, you have the ordination of the Levites, and one distinction here is that the age is now 25 to be able to minister in this way, and previously 4 chapters earlier it was 30, so no clear distinction on whether this is training or they needed more people, but anyway, this is the new age given. Some distinctions in chapter 9 on what to do regarding Passover. If someone's unclean, they can celebrate a month later. If they're ritually impure from like touching a corpse or something like that. And finally, chapter 10 is a very important chapter in that it marks a transition to where they will now set out. Instructions are given on trumpets and traveling, now leaving Sinai for the first time, now that they've received all the law and the covenant, all the special details about how God will relate to them during this time. And they'll now travel until they settle in the wilderness of Paran. So you have, again, the biggest kind of transition here into what we understand is the whole rest of the story until they get to the promised land. So we'll see much of that throughout the rest of the book now. So much going on in Numbers 11 through 13 today. 3 different locations. You have, in chapter 11, you have complaints that come, fire that burns on the outside of the camp, and this tabara, meaning burning, is the first location here in the first few verses. And God has this way of kind of cleansing the people, even though they continue to have issues and complaints. Moses also has some of these same kind of complaints. And in the end of chapter 11, you see how God moves some of his spirit that he's been dealing with Moses onto 70 other leaders. And there's actually prophesying that takes place. Some prophesy, there's 2 that prophesy away from the group. And Joshua was very frustrated by it. Moses puts him in his place, however, and says that he wishes there would be more like them throughout the congregation. So you have all these things that are happening that are positive, but also the complaints from the very beginning are answered by God saying that he would send quail. Now, remember, this happened briefly at one point way back in Exodus, before Mount Sinai even. But now the complaints again arise in the wilderness, and God's answer this time is that they'd have to eat quail for a month. And not only do they eat quail, as they begin, right as soon as they start, there's actually a plague that hits the different ones. We don't know exactly who were affected by the plague, but the name of that place would be named after a grave of cravings. And so the type of sin that they were experiencing was more than just a simple complaint. There was a heart problem going on, and several were. Speaking of heart problem, you have chapter 12, Aaron and Miriam that become jealous of Moses, other leaders envying the type of relationship that he has with God and the leadership responsibilities. Miriam specifically complains about Moses' wife when they are actually all summoned, the 3 siblings, to the Lord right there at the congregation tent. God calls Miriam and Aaron up. And then specifically, Miriam is struck with leprosy. Now, Aaron confesses and repents of this, and Miriam will have to stay outside the camp for 7 days. But this is at least alleviated during this time. What's even more challenging is chapter 13, and we'll see much of this going forward. But you have one person from each tribe that's sent out as spies, special people that are to go out from the camp there at the wilderness of Paran and go into the promised land to check out, see what the fortifications are, see what about the people that are there. They come back specifically having been told to bring some of the fruit and some of the goods that are there, talking about how wonderful the land is flowing with milk and honey. They bring grapes back that are so big that one cluster has to be carried by 2 men on a pole. they talk about how great the people are that are there, that they feel like they're grasshoppers in their sight. Now, there's 6 different people groups that are in the land, but the point of this was to inspire the people. Caleb jumps up and says we should pursue, and the God will give them the victory. But the others are not that confident. Obviously, the camp's very concerned. And we will see the ramifications of this in the next chapter and going forward. Numbers 14, you see the results of the doubting and the lack of faith in the children of Israel. God intervenes right when they're about to pick a new leader and stone Moses and Aaron, despite the last chance that Caleb and Joshua has given the people to pursue into the promised land. God tells everyone that they would actually die in the wilderness after 40 years, and the generation to follow would be the one that would enter. They had previously been concerned about their children dying out there, but God says, no, they will be the ones to carry in. So all the people numbered in the first chapters of Numbers, those that are 20 and up, they would actually not make it out of the wilderness. So you have all this transpire, and then the next day, after being told this, the people decide to pursue, to go up in. With God not being with them, Moses and the Ark of the Covenant still being back in the camp, they were actually chased away, which makes sense considering their disobedience prior to that. So all this has gone forward. Caleb and Joshua are absolved from all this because of their faith throughout the process, and Moses actually has to intervene for the people as God would have started over again, similar to back with the golden calf incident. You have Moses reminding God of his word, reminding God of all that they've come through since the exit from Egypt, and all this is allowed to remain. Chapter 15 is a symbol of hope and faith after all this has transpired negatively. There are some sacrificial specifications given for when they do enter into the promised land, obviously being passed down for the children's knowledge. And the very final part of chapter 15 is they are to put tassels on their clothing to remind. Numbers 16 and 17, you have Korah's rebellion, which is a very famous passage. Literally the ground opens and swallows some Levites that were discontent with their role, wanting to usurp Aaron. Aaron would later actually atone for the larger group, rushing to put his correct coal on the censer on the altar. And that stopped a plague from kind of spreading across the camp, rushing the tabernacle of witness. That's fully complete, not just with blooms, but with ripe almonds. So you see all this kind of comprised in these 2 chapters. Very well known because of the severity of the from one side to another. In the following chapter 17, you have Aaron's leadership confirmed and reaffirmed by God, hid by his hand and his witness, when Aaron's staff buds overnight next to the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of Witness. But also worth noting that God's glory and manifest presence appears to several people here at one time, similar to when Aaron and Miriam were rising up against Moses, and God's presence again appeared to them, the 3 of them at one time. So not always a good thing during this time when that would happen, but definitely, God's willing to stand up and make a point when it needs to take place. Numbers chapter 18, you have some priestly, almost Levitical instructions for Aaron, or whichever priest to follow, aligning responsibility for the Levites and stressing the importance of the position. Numbers 19, you have some important purification rules, especially after all the death found in chapter 16 following Korah's event. And chapter 20, there are 3 different deaths. Miriam, right off the bat, Aaron towards the end of the chapter, and eventually you'll see Moses, because of what happens here, the waters of Meribah. God instructs Moses to respond to the people's complaints by speaking to the rock, but instead he strikes the rock with the rod. Of course, this has worked in the past, but it was not God's specific instruction. So disobeying, this is what causes Aaron's death, and eventually will keep Moses from being able to go into the promised land. And finally, the Edomites, who are descendants of Esau, do not give passage to the Israelites, even after several rounds of requests and negotiation that come out in force and turn the Israelites away. So many challenges in these chapters for the Israelites, and much mourning, considering the loss of some of their leaders. Numbers chapter 21, you have a lot of battles that happen. The children of Israel have moved around the Edomites, but they come into many other areas that are confrontational, and God gives them victory time and time again. Obviously, you can tell that God has brought them through the wilderness, but not only that, God has given them victory in each individual step. There is still complaining that does happen towards the beginning of chapter 21. This time there are venomous snakes that afflict the children of Israel. God punishes the children with this, and the remedy is something similar to what you saw back in the breeding of the goats and livestock of Jacob and Laban, something that was culturally understood, commonplace at the time, but Moses is effectively told to make a bronze snake just like the ones that were afflicting the people, to lift it up on a pole, and that anyone looking at this serpent, this bronze serpent, would be saved. And in the New Testament, Jesus actually uses this as a picture to describe salvation, to kind of typecast himself on the cross, to understand, like, looking upon the sacrifice that would be made, and believing in faith, receiving that. If he's lifted up, he draw all men unto himself. So a lot can be gleaned from this, even though kind of it's a brief passage in the grand scheme of things. And then chapter 22, you have a lot about Balaam, who is a very, very well-known prophet. It's interesting because Balak, who is the Moabite king, wants to pay Balaam to come and to curse the children of Israel when he sees them approaching his area. Obviously, they're very well known now for all these battles and conquering that has just taken place in the different surrounding areas. I'll leave my primary commentary for the next couple chapters, because the donkey really steals the show in chapter 22, and that's the irony of it. With as well known as Balaam was, he is outshone by a donkey in this chapter. And the angel of the Lord shows up, the donkey sees the angel, and then the dialogue between the donkey and Balaam are really kind of what turns Balaam on his head in this chapter. So more to come in chapters 23 and 24 on Balaam.
Numbers 23 through 25, you have Balaam prophesying 3 times, blessing Israel, and Balak gets fed up and sends him home. But on the way out, kind of for the road, Balaam prophesies again, kind of one last parting gift. And that's where you really see some of the strongest kind of messianic prophecies, especially kind of regarding the power of the Davidic kingdom. So one other thing that I like to think about when considering these areas where he's prophesying and looking down is to remember the image of the tribes, the way the layout was, and the numbers of people that we talked about in the first chapters of Numbers. He's looking down on this shape of a cross and being forced to utter these prophecies, which is a neat aspect of these things. Then you have chapter 25, and in this chapter, the Midianites ensnaring the Israelites in the worship of other gods. And you have one man's act of righteous judgment that stops a plague that had already killed 24,000 people within the camp. Later in Numbers, we'll see that Balaam dies with other leaders of Midian. So it's quite possible that he's behind the scenes of what's going on in chapter 25. And his good that's done in the other 2 chapters is purely because of God's sovereignty, not due to Balaam's righteous character. The New Testament confirms his kind of corrupt heart. And to understand these passages where you see God's word coming forth in spite of the actual messenger themselves.
Numbers chapter 26 and 27. Since chapter 13, you've had around 38 years of time that has passed, because now in chapter 26, 27, you are looking at the end of the wilderness period. The first generation that rejected God in Numbers 13 has now passed away, minus Moses. And of course, Caleb and Joshua, who will enter the promised land. They take the second census of the book of Numbers, this new generation. That's chapter 26 and chapter 27. A few different things happen. One special thing of note is Moses is told to go up on top of a mountain and get a peek of the promised land, which is kind of the last moment before he will die. And not only that, but specifically pass on some of the leadership to Joshua. That specifically came after Moses had petitioned God to raise up a new leader and not leave the people like a sheep without a shepherd. So this happens. God tells him to commission Joshua in front of the people with the high priests, and that they would transfer that kind of mantle. And the other point that's interesting here towards the beginning of chapter 27 is there is a very redemptive kind of beyond its time happening for its time period in the ancient Near East. You have one of the tribes where there's no sons to claim any kind of inheritance, where the land's being divided up as they're about to enter in. And Moses hears the petitions of these daughters of the tribe, and he agrees. He agrees that there needs to be justice done on their part. So that's a very interesting portion that's very different for the time that they're living in. Numbers chapter 28 and 29, you have regulations that are given on all the sacrifices that we have already been talked about, daily, weekly, monthly times, as well as the specific festivals, and all the regulations that are to be had with that will be listed in chapter 29. Chapter 30 deals with specific laws regarding vows. And if you take a look at those, it really enhances kind of our understanding of the importance of family and just the different time that was living in. Women could be released from vows by petition of their father or husband, or some type of relationship like that. And so those were kind of nuances that were being given in between the time period before they would go in and conquer the Promised Land. So bless y'all today, and we look forward to the next chapter. 3 things in Numbers chapter 31. First of all, you have Balaam, who is listed here as being among the people that are killed during this battle. And that's really what first kind of foreshadows him being a corrupt individual. And then beyond that, you understand his involvement in different things. And in the future conquests, you'll see another theme arise, which is really the second point I want to draw out here, is that much of this chapter revolves around how the children of Israel did not follow the specific rules they were given for the conquest. And so this is kind of a big focus. And finally, one thing that would be easy to assume is that the Midianites are totally wiped out because of this, but they do appear later on in the book of Judges. So that is not the case. Also, chapter 32, you understand what could appear as kind of a compromise between 2.5 of the tribes, but you will see that really what was the issue was Moses was afraid that the 2.5 tribes were afraid again to go into the Promised Land, similar to how Numbers 13 had gone down, which is what caused an entire generation to pass before entering. But instead, the land was really good for their livestock on the east side of the Jordan. So there's this deal worked out to where they will go in and help conquer, and then the land that they had claimed they could go back and return to and set up their shops. So this is kind of the gist of these 2 chapters, and we are again approaching just the final 4 chapters of Numbers. Numbers 33, you almost have a journal entry, the first part of the chapter, with all the different places that the children of Israel have gone through the wilderness. Moses has taken very, very good notes. And then the back half of the chapter, you have some specific instructions the Lord gives regarding once they enter the Promised Land. They do have to completely wipe out the people that are there. There cannot be compromise in those sense. And the challenge that the children of Israel will fall in the same way if they choose not to do this. Chapter 34, a few different things, but specifically you have the borders set up for where the land will go to, what the Promised Land will be encompassed with, and then the back half of the chapter is the leaders that will help to execute this plan. So all the tribes will be laid out, and these details are given here in these chapters. Wrapping up the book of Numbers with chapter 35 and 36, first off, you have some specifics for the cities that the Levites would live in once they got to the Promised Land, and then also some kind of designations and nuances for cities. Whenever someone would be accused or suspected of manslaughter, some distinctions given on how to handle murder cases and witnesses that needed to be had for things to be corroborated, and other loopholes addressed in chapter 36 regarding Zelophehad and the females that were inheriting land because there were no husbands in the picture. So this is actually the Manasseh tribe, is chapter 27 of the book of Numbers that this was addressed. So you have a lot of loopholes like this kind of thing that is being pulled together right at the very end of the book of Numbers. So it's a blessing to go through this, and Deuteronomy